Joined once again by Larimer County Sheriff Justin Smith. Thank you for your time.
Good afternoon, Kyle. Glad to join you.
Let me ask you, before we discuss the specifics of the bill before the legislature, what police reforms do you think Colorado needs?
Well, the sheriffs and chiefs have come together following what happened and what we saw in Minnesota, and recognize that not only did they have the officer take the actions that he took, but they had a failure to intervene by several officers on scene. And that's part of what shocked and appalled all of us that saw it. And we recognized that despite a statute that has mandatory reporting in Colorado, that statute, while it's an expectation for our agencies, doesn't have a mandatory intervention, requiring intervention in those. And we've actually put together, proposed a statutory change that would do that, because that's specifically what came out in Minneapolis.
What did you think when you first watched and listened to that video of George Floyd's death?
Yeah, I got to be honest. When I first saw it, I was in disbelief. I honestly couldn't believe what I was seeing. And I waited to learn more and say, is there something I'm not seeing here? And then, like you and like the rest of the country, I saw, more footage, and it only became more appalling to recognize that this was an individual who was restrained. There was no doubt about that. He had gone into restraints earlier when they were walking him around, and to realize in that first picture, I never saw that there were multiple officers on the rest of his body. I saw a guy on the ground. Certainly, to ever put pressure on a neck like that is something, in my 30 years of law enforcement, it's never been acceptable. We've never taught it. I've not seen that type of stuff. And then to learn that all those other officers were there, there was absolutely no reason. And like you, to watch that unfold minute after minute and watch an individual's life drain out of them for absolutely no reason, sickened and disgusted me. Sadly, in this profession, you see people die. It's something you never want to see. And to see it happen at the hands of a police officer who took an oath to protect his community and did that angered and sickened me.
I think for a long time, a lot of the discussion about incidents of use of force involving law enforcement officers were, shootings or beatings or things like that. It seems like more and more we're talking about restraint and how poor restraint techniques, or just what we saw in Minnesota, can be dangerous. Are you convinced that the men and women who work under you know how to properly restrain somebody without causing them harm?
Well, and that was more than restraining. The restraining them down, there certainly are some challenges to what we referred to, for the last couple of decades as positional asphyxia. That was one of those where, 30, 40 years ago, there was not that recognition that when you put somebody's hands behind their back and potentially pulled their feet up, put them on their chest, despite the fact that may not have been with ill intent, that medically we understand that's not a position to be in. And we reduce and minimize the potential ever happening. And as soon as a person's brought into custody and no longer actively fighting, we get them out of that position. So, when I see that, I don't see that as an ongoing problem. It pops up on rare occasion because there's still violent encounters, one-on-one, where the officer's literally fighting for their life. And sometimes those things will happen in that type of an encounter. But to see this, where that certainly wasn't the case, was just shocking.
Democratic State Representative Leslie Herod of Denver is introducing a police accountability bill, announced it yesterday to protesters. It's getting fast-tracked through the end of this session. What are your thoughts of her proposed reforms as much as you've seen them?
Well, I'm tremendously disappointed, not only in Representative Herod, but the whole Democratic legislature down there, because as far as I'm concerned, this was an absolutely dishonest bill. Ever since the legislature's been out of session, law enforcement's been talking about the things that we need to do and what's going to happen in the couple of weeks that they're open to deal with the budget. And there was this promise not to worry, everything that goes through will be fast, friendly, and free. These are things we can get through, we can agree upon, and aren't going to impact budgets because we know how tough it is. And yet we heard Monday rumors of some bill from Representative Herod that she never cared to discuss with anybody in the field who would be the ones you'd want to talk to about this. And it was dropped essentially about 6 o'clock yesterday morning as a draft with no number on it, with a general invite that she would have a Zoom discussion with us for 1 hour yesterday. And so chiefs, sheriffs, district attorneys, the FOP, cities, counties were able to call in. I was a little bit surprised that somebody who brags that she's spending all of her time writing this bill and protesting for the next 2 weeks wouldn't even allow chiefs and sheriffs to come in and face to face with her. She wouldn't even bring a camera up to have that real conversation back and forth. And so we see this bill that's 25 pages that, Kyle, it literally upends public safety, the criminal justice system, as it's been built not only by statute for decades, but by case law that's developed. And it doesn't say, hey, let's discuss these issues. It simply was a bill that said 25 pages. It was wiping out tenets and principles of criminal justice. And honestly, what it felt like to me was that somebody snuck up behind you, Kyle, put a knife to your throat and said, I'm here to negotiate your safety. And that's literally what it felt like, because what she told us is, here's the bill. It's going to pass. If you want some changes, certainly, offer up your changes. So it really frustrated me. It was crazy to see something happen like that. And to see it from Herod, honestly, it's not that much of a surprise. She has treated us like that. But to see every member of the Democratic legislature apparently sign on, House and Senate, still doesn't have a number. It hasn't been assigned a number. We've got everyone on there, and that's their word to us. This will pass. They're just, they've let us know that by putting it in that form. And there was discussion about hearings starting today or tomorrow on a bill that we have no fiscal note. And so with that, I'm really disillusioned and appalled by what's going on.
Let's dig into your specific concerns about what's in the bill, starting with the issue that you think poses the greatest problem for public safety.
Well, first and foremost, there's a lot of things that concern me, Kyle, but there's one that deals with what we refer to as qualified immunity. The concept, and it came through the courts in years of decisions, was that a peace officer, it's an inherently dangerous job. They have to make decisions at a moment's notice, and it recognizes that police officers can't be perfect. Nobody's perfect. And so it recognized that how they would be judged in their decision making on Fourth Amendment issues, and things like that would be based on the case law, the knowledge that's there. And what it essentially says, if you're acting in good faith on cases that courts might spend weeks or months deciding and get appealed and overruled, that in that moment you make it, you're acting in good faith. You have protections for that. And this throws it out the window. It says any violation of any constitutional right, state or federal, is actionable against the officer. And I just remind folks that, that sounds good, as a talking point, but every time an officer contacts anyone in the community, a traffic stop, a pedestrian stop, a contact, that's a Fourth Amendment question. And every time they do that, if a court were to come back and say, well, we're not sure because of this tiny little detail, they're subject to a lawsuit. And so that part, I think, is just shocking. People understand it. And the other is...
Let's dig into that real quick before we go on to the next one. So pretend qualified immunity goes away tomorrow for all the folks who work under you.
Mm-hmm.
What would practically change in terms of the way that they do their job and deal with the public?
What practically is going to change is this is not going to be nearly as safe a community, because the people in this state count on their police officers being out there to confront people that are potentially violating the law. But if every time an officer does anything in the field, they're risking their children, their wife, their family's financial future for the first $100,000 of a lawsuit, why would they go and intervene? The courts determined a long time ago that there's not a legal duty to intervene and stop a criminal act. Amazingly, people don't realize that. And so that officer, why would they go out there? The other part that I think this brings into it is, and you recognize it's a difficult job. It's hard to get folks to come into this profession these days. Who's going to apply for that job? There's other jobs that pay this amount of money and certainly more that don't have that risk. So if the idea on this is you want to get better officers, who with a good reason and logic is going to decide that's a wise decision? So I look at it not simply from the officer standpoint, and that certainly does concern me, but the community standpoint. We don't have perfect officers, but I've been around this country. I travel a lot. I work with national sheriffs. There's a lot of things going on. Colorado does it certainly better than most. We've got some great folks, and this doesn't have any incentive for them to stay in the business.
I'm sure some folks would argue that if every officer had all that on the line with every citizen interaction, they'd be a hell of a lot more careful, and probably it would save some lives.
Well, I think just the opposite. They're going to not act. Why would they act? Why would they intervene? What was interesting was the bill, as it dropped yesterday, before 10 pages were stripped out, actually talked about a liability if a citizen received serious bodily injury or died because of the action or inaction of an officer. Overnight, that disappeared. But think about that portion of the bill with the school shootings. All of a sudden we forgot about the school shootings and the officers that go in. The one that was known as the coward of Broward would be very logical under the way this bill was crafted as of yesterday. Of why would you act? And so that's what it's likely to drive. And again, it's going to drive out those who think about this profession logically, who love their family, their children, their community, and are trying to earn a living. They're going to pick a different line of work. It's difficult to justify continuing when everything you do rolls the dice. And again, it's not a matter of doing things bad. It's those decisions that when you look at the Supreme Court or you look at a court of appeals, Kyle, those things rarely ever come as a unanimous verdict. They're split. And you're looking and saying if the officer doesn't pick in a second the correct split verdict, it's $100,000. But it's just continual lawsuits. So it's sad. We could have gone better. We could have had conversations. And I think it's horribly disappointing that there was no desire to have those.
Let me ask you, do you think that it is too easy for officers with a history of disciplinary trouble to get rehired at other departments in Colorado? That's another thing that Representative Hurried has said.
Well, I think we certainly have some challenges. I'm on the post board and have been for a couple of years and have dealt with these issues for some time. There have been some problems in the past. There still are some problems. We've made great advancements, and this bill doesn't recognize the advancements. Just last year, the bill got put through that deals with those who are dishonest so that they can't be brought back in and that the post board can decertify those individuals. We had a bill not too long before that increased the number of convictions that disqualify folks from coming in. But I'll tell you, there is a challenge out there. And for the most part, Kyle, that's the rural parts of our state, the ones that and you talk to folks in the four corners of our state and the outlying areas where they have some real challenges financially, and they can't pay what the cities pay. When they can pay a police officer $35,000 a year and they can make 60 or 70 in one of the cities, they can't keep folks. What I've proposed, I've talked to legislators about, is finding ways to fund, and we've made some improvements of how they can hire hometown, young women and young men, or mature young women, mature men and women, to come and police that will stay there. They're committed. Those are the kind of things that would be positive. But just without talking to us, without looking at what the post board has done, to throw these wholesale changes in, under the guise of it's needed, really is very disingenuous.
At the end of the day, when it comes to the process of the legislature, there's also just the pure political issue that the state of the Colorado Republican Party has rendered them virtually powerless in the legislature. So the only way to stop something from passing, if you're intent on stopping that, is convincing some centrist Democrats to not vote with their party. We see that the Senate president is on this bill. It certainly looks like they've got everybody together. Is the law enforcement community thinking there's still a chance to convince a few Democrats to change their mind, or is your focus on change what we can of this bill because it's going to pass?
Well, we're a little over 24 hours into any knowledge of the bill, and there's a lot of discussions between sheriffs and chiefs and cities and counties and the FOP and folks. So I don't know if there's a consensus there yet. Certainly, we would hope that some discussion and good sense would come back in. A desire to have that communication. Certainly, we work to maintain communication with the governor's office because obviously you still have a need for a governor's signature on any bill that goes through. And I think the other part of that is the district attorneys coming forward to explain. Maybe they'll listen to the district attorneys, CML and CCI, the counties and cities. This will have a significant fiscal impact in many ways on them. And, maybe some good sense comes in to go, wait a minute, we've got a lot of challenges. We can work to solve problems by having some conversations, interim committee, discuss possibilities. It certainly doesn't look like it now, but If you don't know, Kyle, I'm a guy that doesn't give up. And chiefs and sheriffs aren't ones to be typically intimidated. We lead law enforcement agencies that run towards citizens that are running away from gunfire. So maybe we're not the smartest group out there sometimes because we're just not going to quit. But I can tell you that's certainly my take on it is I think what we're doing is the right thing, fighting for this, fighting for some logic and reason. And I'll go down absolutely fighting this thing to fix it and or stop it until the end. Even if I lose, it's the right thing to do.
One last question for you, Sheriff Smith. We're headed for a seventh consecutive day and night of protests in Denver. A lot of different Americans have a lot of different thoughts when they watch the pictures of those protests in our city. What do you think when you watch?
Well, when I see individuals that are exercising their First Amendment right, I'm proud. That's a part of what I fight for, is the liberties in the Constitution guaranteeing the right to address your grievances, but to do it peacefully. And, I've seen some improvements in different areas. I'm still seeing a significant amount of violence in different parts of the country. I've truly lost track of the number of officers that have been shot in the last several days. We've never seen these kind of numbers. That angers and frustrates me. But also look at the property. 2 months ago, here we were all together talking about this COVID pandemic and how we're going to get through that. We've got business owners that just a week and a half ago finally saw the light at the end of the tunnel, Kyle, that they thought this was their opportunity to get their business open, to re-employ people. And now I look at the cities and we see, separate from the people that were peacefully protesting early, we see rioters and looters destroying that. That part just sickens me because essentially we're dismantling our country. We're punishing, anybody that has things in those communities. And we just got to come to an end to that. We have to get back to this being an opportunity to work together. As I look at it, I've yet to see anybody who offered any excuse or explanation for the actions of that officer or those officers in Minneapolis. We've got agreement there. Police chiefs, sheriffs, officers, troopers, everybody says this was a criminal act. You know what? That tragedy could actually bring us together. Sadly, with what we're witnessing, in a lot of ways, it's not. It's tearing us apart.
Sheriff Smith, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming out to share your views, and we'll continue to follow this bill as it moves through the Capitol.
Thank you, Kyle.